Great, and great to have such a gang. Some faces that I recognise from last night. Thanks a lot for coming back. And we're rather hoping that that you'll join in our conversation. So an opportunity to ask questions, it certainly exists. I think at sort of like a halfway mark, we might turn our conversation sort of over to you, and then a sort of a Q&A. I want to begin by talking about the combination of these two exhibitions, something that we're extremely happy about. The work of John Walker here in Birmingham, an artist who left some years ago, but at the start of an extremely exciting, promising career, a real star, a local boy who made good, and it's great to have him back with us, and to have an exhibition, not a survey exhibition, but an exhibition of new work, really getting you up to date with what he's doing now. And then on the other hand, we have the work of Meryl McMaster, someone that you've not met before, someone who comes from a place far away, and an artist who is similarly a rising star now in Canada and internationally, and it's a privilege, Meryl, to have you too with us. Artist who, to some extent, will be talking across generations and, of course, across different media. And exciting to have a conversation, not established artist working with paint talking to another established artist working with paint, that your work, that you'll be making observations, and you have been over the last week, about each other's work, and it makes us sort of think a little bit deeper about the propositions of your works, because there are a lot of things that you share. Obviously, in making this juxtaposition, the painting of John's sort of very abstracted in many ways foils that of Meryl, or the other way around. It's nice putting things together that don't look the same, but there's an awful lot that you're saying to each other through the exhibitions and subsequently to us. So I thought I'd begin by making an observation that was occurring to me as I was at the University of Birmingham today with John. We were looking at a work of his called The Blue Cloud. It was painted in the 1990s. And John, I think you were living in Australia. Were you in Australia then, or you were in the States? I think you were in the States.
I just moved back from Australia.
Yeah, and it's full of influences. Australian Aboriginal influence coming through, but also poetry that you were writing into your work at that stage. And that, I think, was quite a new thing. You're quoting Lord Byron, you're also quoting Wilfred Owen.
Right.
And then, of course, in Meryl's work downstairs, we have a series of new photographic pieces, and there are poems there as well. There is a poetry, and John, you've talked quite a lot over the last week about poetry and painting, and I thought poetry is as a sort of jumping off point for our conversation now. So,
the poetry I was using, you're right, was I was going through a hurtful stage, self-inflicted hurtful stage in my life of missing, I suppose, missing England.
Yep.
And so there's a wonderful poem by Byron about missing Albion, and so that was a kind of comforting. So I was looking for comforting poems. I was also addressing missing my father and trying to remember conversations and trying to have conversations through my work with him. So that painting at the university is very much those kind of things.
Yes, it's actually more explicitly autobiographical than a lot of your work, I think.
Almost anything. It's almost entirely about those kind of things. And also struggling with this, I was also making big changes in my, I was going through the period of, hey, you're going too far away from painting, get back, start, picking up that oil paint again, start doing what you love. The painting had taken me a little too far away from the things I cared about, which often happens, has happened in my career.
And you also talk about the importance of poetry in painting, and the idea that if you have painting without poetry, well, it's not something that you want.
I've always thought of all the arts that poetry was, and poets were closest to me, to painting. But most of my dearest friends were poets, and I always encouraged my students to be involved with verse. That sometimes the idea of talking with a brush is akin to poetry.
And so we're fixing this microphone here so you don't.
Thank you.
A bit kind of closer to your mouth, and then probably kind of clearer. That's great. And Meryl, you're writing poetry, and the poems that you're writing are there alongside the photographs that are being shown downstairs. And I think that's the first. No, is it the first time, in fact, that you've exhibited your work in that way?
Yes, it is. It was kind of unexpected, I guess, to include poetry with this new body of work. It kind of happened. The exhibition that I made this body of work for back in Canada, the curator actually was encouraging me to write text for each image in the gallery space, and she kind of suggested maybe you could write about 100 words and we could have this text beside the image. And not kind of thinking too much about it, I agreed. I was like, sure, yeah, I'll do that. And because I guess she was thinking that there's lots of layers within my images and my work, and I guess through sharing, the stories behind them, she felt that she wanted me to, in some way, share this with the viewer, because they might not get these stories from first glance. And so, I started to try to write this 100-word short paragraphs, and I just, I was very unhappy with it. I felt, you actually don't, it's kind of a very old-fashioned, I guess, way of doing things. Like, you really only see that in museums and having these, panels of text describing maybe historical or objects. And I also felt that when I was writing these texts, that people would then only assume that there was one meaning behind the images. And part of my, want is that actually that the viewer doesn't only have one reading, that these images can allow someone to be inspired to go on their own, down their own kind of imagination, their own storyline on their own. and not always be influenced only by the words of myself. And so I decided that instead of having these these texts beside the images, that I through these little writings I did was actually extract words and sentences from what I wrote and create these poems, so that there was this more open-ended reading to the work, but yet at the same time it allowed the viewer to have a little bit of have a way to enter the work at the same time. And I think in the end I was happy with it. I was happy to kind of for the first time incorporate text and in this poetic way, because I think I try to do that, I think, within the images in some way as well, kind of create these poetic images. So, and I think, I mean, funnily enough, when I am thinking about titles, I do sometimes read poetry to kind of be inspired by the use of language, and so it entered my work even before these texts, kind of being just interested in poetry in some way. So, and
the poems are in English, but there's also the translation into Plains Cree, which is your First Nation language.
Yeah, it's one of my. I come from mixed cultural backgrounds, and I'm Nehio or Plains Cree, and they come from the prairies in Canada and in the central part of Canada. And I did want to include the language, the Plains Cree language, in the exhibition space. It is this year is the year of international of languages, so that was also kind of to keep bringing awareness to that, and also make that statement as well, to have that my First Nations language in the exhibition. But funny enough, getting them translated through my mentors within my home communities, they were telling me that Crees would never write poems because the language is already a poetic language. So it wouldn't usually happen. So the translators that helped me, tried to do their best that they could to translate it as accurately as possible, but yeah, so I thought that was interesting.
It's an interesting situation that is analogous actually to the distance that you feel from. I mean, this is referring also to the point that John is making. There's a sort of translation, but a translation to a place or a particular kind, a way of living, or a point in history. And a lot of your work is about sort of moving imaginatively into a place where you imagine you might have been, or you're encouraging us to go there as well. The fact that you're getting someone to translate what you write in English into the language of that community, your community, is interesting. In the same way that Meryl lives in Ottawa, but a lot of photographs are taken in places that have a bearing on your cultural heritage. And again, there's that kind of idea of moving back, or not even moving to a place, not necessarily returning to a place.
Yeah, I mean, this new body of work that you'll see in the gallery space has actually been my first opportunity to be able to photograph, and in places that are very familiar to me and my family, but also places I've never been to, but are in and around where my family resides in Saskatchewan, as well as in southern Ontario. So so I feel like I kind of have two homes, I guess. I was born and raised in Ottawa, in the eastern, kind of part of Canada. But my mom and my father both grew up and born, and all my family's in Saskatchewan. So I've always, even though I've never lived where my First Nations, where my mother's family grew up, I still feel a connection to that landscape, and I do call it kind of home. But it was an interesting process researching some of these different locations and the history behind them, not only the First Nations history and but also the history of the landscape predating human activity. So it was an interesting kind of project to be part of.
And John, your home is where you are living now in Maine. A coastal location is very inspiring for the work, and you can see reference to it, a kind of tidal sort of rhythm in your work, for example, and suggestion of sort of a more fluid environment where it sort of hits, perhaps hits a kind of a coastline. But then there is where you are, but there's also sort of where you're referring, and also where your family's been, interestingly. I mean, your reference to your father, for example, in the work, The Blue Cloud, it's something that has had a profound effect on the way you reflect upon your own identity, the way you talk about mud, for example. I mean, there's mud in this landscape where you are now, but there was mud in that place where your father experienced such awfulness. There's a kind of, it's not as if, you're bringing things to this place as well as well as responding to it in itself.
I think where I am, the place where I am now, was a desire to have a place. In that I'd lived in Australia, I'd lived in New York, I'd lived in other parts of the States, and I hadn't lived in England and for a while, and as I explained earlier, that was hurtful in many ways, and so I needed a place, and so this place felt good, became mine. Everything there, I felt I could become knowledgeable and expert about, and I could. It made me make paintings. So that's my place. And
by painting it, I think it becomes yours in the same way you've referred to Cézanne's ownership of Mont Sainte-Victoire, a place that he painted, meditated on, knew it sort of better than anyone else. And you like the idea that this particular part of the world becomes your Mont Sainte-Victoire.
Yes, and it's very private. Someone recently wrote about me, a Maine art critic, said that I was really pleased about it, that they said, someone had asked them, do you know John Walker? And they said, yes, and do you ever see him? And he said, no, he's like the proverbial Maine bear. We know he's there, but no one ever sees him. because I'm in my place, and I'm painting, and it's become really, as a very young boy here in Birmingham, I told my mother when I was 7 years of age I was going to be a painter. And and she encouraged that. And now, every now and again, I turn around and say, look, I did it. You know, and I'm doing it in my place. Yeah.
And that idea of having a place in a landscape is important, and it's there, not as sort of clearly as, Meryl literally puts herself in that landscape, and we see photographic evidence of that. And you're, it's such a long way from Birmingham where you are now. Can you talk about? What kind of relationship it is with the landscape? Is it a romantic one? Is it a poetic one?
I love Constable, for instance, and so all the things I love about Constable, it's the smell, literally. All that everything I see in a Constable, I can find in my place, and so and it's challenging because of that.
There's arguably there's a sort of essentialism which is starting to sort of come through in the later work, and I think Meryl, in your work there is an idea of somehow recasting a relationship with the natural world, which has an awful lot to do with indigenous tradition. Do you want to talk about that? A kind of relationship that you want to forge, which to some extent is in counterbalance to a more sort of modern Western way, and arguably, and I think you're quite environmentalist actually in your proposition, and that probably has a lot to do with your cultural heritage.
Yeah, my interest in the outdoors has really started at a young age, and not just only in my upbringing, but just it became a very fascinating, I guess, place for me. Into my teens, I really was interested in doing camping, and I got opportunities to do some interesting remote camping experiences, that doing a mountaineering trip and also like a 30-day long whitewater canoe trip, and those two experiences really took me out of my comfort zone. I never quite done that before, and it really opened my eyes to my relationship with the world, my relationship with others, and really, I think, if anything, that really, those moments that I had, I think really, I guess, forged my relationship and my respect with my natural surroundings. And after that, I did tree planting and outdoor guiding, and I think that, again, all those experiences have been found their way into my images, kind of consciously or unconsciously. But it's I think that my relationship with landscape on a personal level, thinking of my First Nations background, that's been a lifelong kind of maybe struggle, I guess, to connect with, because I grew up, was born in Ottawa, away from my family, my home reserve in Saskatchewan. My whole life, there's always been this need and trying to find belonging to place, being very disconnected in some ways, only going to visit, my family once a year, and so I think through my work, it's almost trying to just continue that connection and to a place that is very much part of me, but at some points is undiscovered, and I'm still learning. I'm still learning the language and the stories of these places, and I think it'll be a lifelong process, personally, and I think also through my artwork, because that's, I think, we're, especially in this moment in time, I think, being aware of the land that we stand on, and the importance that we need to take care of it is something that I hope and I think is on a lot of people's minds. So, through my images, this is a way of, kind of communicating some of these thoughts that I have, and a reminder of these beautiful places that we may lose. So,
the beautiful places is something I wanted to touch on with respect to John's work as well, because he's got a problem with simply beautiful places, and it's interesting too, of course, in relation to the question of sustainability and an Aboriginal relationship with the landscape that you became aware of during your time in Australia. But then, I know that you found it difficult when you first arrived in Maine to kind of latch onto your surroundings, because it was too beautiful, and you were sort of waiting for it to reveal itself as an edgy place, and you were quite excited to find a sort of a small inlet that you called Shitty Cove, because it wasn't so beautiful. It had an edge that you could then kind of respond to. So you're not simply epitomizing what is beautiful in nature.
No, I was coming from a New York loft situation into this beautiful landscape. And it took me about 10 years to actually move out into the landscape to paint. It wasn't easy. And I was like going into this dark studio in the middle of this peninsula and carrying on my international artwork sort of thing. So it took a while. And then I did find the one place where all the debris and all the smelly stuff came into this one particular cove, and it seemed to be the right place to set up.
Do you think, not wanting to cast nasturtiums, but do you think that you were harking back a little bit then to your younger self in Birmingham? Birmingham is not famous for its picturesque qualities.
But I don't remember Birmingham like that. You see, I had a wonderful childhood. I lived, on a housing estate on the outskirts of Birmingham. At that time, in the outskirts. Now Birmingham is spread miles further out. It's all been engulfed. But the fields were just like a block away, and so I could run and get into trouble with the local farmers over in Bartley Green and the Cadbury estate. So I had like a wonderful childhood, and then I had two brothers who came back from the war, who were, I guess, they never thought about it in those days, but who were heavily traumatized, and all they wanted to do really was go fishing. And so I saw all of Herefordshire and the Wide Valley and through these brothers. So I felt more I was a country boy rather than a Birmingham boy in that sense. And so I had a really blessed childhood, because I had these two elder brothers who were like an extra couple of fathers turning up, to take me every beautiful place I needed to go.
When I went to visit John and to make a selection of the work, we sort of made photographs and made a kind of collage of an exhibition plan. Meryl uses SketchUp. I have to say, in the case of me and John, it was a real collage, cut and paste number. And then I sent you back kind of plan, and you said, so where are the paintings with the fishes in them? And I said, well, there is one, and you know, it's there. You see the fishes on the at the top of that painting, and this is a painting that is harking back to those days with your brothers, I think.
Yeah, that was a kind of just an offer to my two brothers who are long gone. But in fact, at the moment in my studio, you know, this is the end of my career as a painter, I think. It's just full of paintings of dead fish, realistically painted. I mean, I'd caught some fish this summer, which I then couldn't resist trying to paint. And they're scattered throughout my studio. And now I must have 30 or 40 paintings of fish. and I'm sort of, every time I walk in, I laugh at myself. But
it's nice. It's kind of another chapter is opening. Well, and speaking of opening another chapter, let's open up a chapter that involves you all. It's a rare chance to speak to these two. I mean, I think you're leaving tomorrow, and John is leaving on Saturday, and you don't often see them in these parts. So please, if there's anything that's sort of recurring to you, something that an observation that you'd like to make, a question, yes?
In the past, you've painted words or text on the page.
yes.
Earlier you mentioned, in the past you've used text and words in your paintings, and earlier you talked about poetry and your love of poetry. I was wondering if kind of literal poetry, writing words on your paintings, might reappear at some point.
Might reappear?
In the way that they have in the past, and in the way that shapes in these paintings, some of them hark back to shapes that appear in earlier canvases.
The text came in when I was doing the homage paintings to my father in the First World War, and in remembering the anecdotes, and he wasn't the kind of person who told you very much, and it wasn't until he was my age now that he slowly sort of told me a few things, and what he said was very much what Robert Graves describes in Goodbye to All That, and then Wilfred Owen's poetry in particular. So to help me paint the pictures, I started to use mainly Wilfred Owen's poetry, and then it helped me to kind of, touch the words to try and bring some of the, to bring my father's words into life, but using it. So there were some, and there must be 50 or 60 of these paintings, which are much bigger than these, that have never been shown. Some smaller ones have, but they were never shown. And at that time, I thought I'd exhausted the text in painting, but occasionally, but now it's out of frustration. If I can't paint it, I'll put something in, but only because the inadequacy of my painting to touch sometimes makes me. But I'm open. I try to go into the studio, with a clear head and a brush that can say it can do anything, so it could happen again.
Thank you for the talk so far. Question for John, perhaps more so. I'm interested in the notion of home and how you express that sensibility to home. Particularly, I'm interested in how our relationship with home perhaps becomes stronger when we leave home, and that kind of duality between presence and absence. And I'm just curious if when you're in Maine, do you paint the place where you came from in Birmingham, or when you're in Birmingham now, or when you travel away from Maine, do you paint the place in Maine, if that makes sense? Or is it entirely within the place where you literally find yourself?
I'm not very good at traveling and painting. I have to kind of be somewhere and identify, and that usually takes a while. So Maine is very important that it's there. Look, I've spent a life worrying in this situation and being depressed by it. That I'm an Englishman, and one of the comforts is England's an island, and if you go away, you're always it's coming back. And I don't know, it's been like 40 years, but I'm also the kind of people who always ask me, why haven't you shown in England for the last 40 years, really? And I've shown everywhere else, sort of thing. And the truth is, I've never been asked. And I'm not the kind of artist who goes out there asking to show their work. And in all truth, it doesn't matter, because lots of other people have asked me elsewhere. Yeah, it's a big hole in my life, of course, oh God, yeah, it's a problem, but I have this place now, and I think that's it, so, and I needed a place. I needed a place for me, for my family, so people can come to me.
Meryl, how about you and home? Do you feel that you're arriving home when you're traveling to these places and working there? And is it a way of making it home for you?
That's a good question. I think that, as I was saying kind of earlier, that these opportunities, this project, was again the first time that I was able to, kind of maybe more on a deeper level, kind of connect with these places. It was a different mindset that I kind of went into each of these different locations that were specifically photographed in Saskatchewan, for example. I think that there's still, these moments where it does feel like home. I mean, it's because it's familiar and because my family's there, and hearing these stories of how they lived and worked off the land, and but at the same time, it still feels, very, very distant in my life, like it. And and that's, I think, something that I've always, again, struggled with my whole life, is just not necessarily feeling like I belong anywhere. Like it's, and that sounds kind of sad, but I think that home for me is where my family is, with my husband, or, with my parents and family, but that changes, but yeah, I think that there is there's a great need to kind of, or want to but you can't always have that, and so yeah.
It's interesting, actually, the degree to which you, in both of your works, your practices, there's this embodiment of a certain a kind of a desire, and there's there's a strong emotional dimension to the work. Yeah. Yes. Microphone behind you.
Hi. Sort of a quick question for Meryl, both about the poetry and the project itself. With the poetry, when I was reading it, there's some words from the Plains Cree that are untranslated in the English versions. When you were saying you were talking with your mentors to get the best sort of translation possible, even though the language itself is already poetic, were those words purposely untranslated? Are they loan words that just don't have an equivalent?
Yeah, good question. No, I purposely wanted to untranslate them. Only certain people will know what they mean, but I think that is part of, I think that with that, making that statement, it's also partly on the viewer then to potentially learn these words. We have good resources now online, but you can look up these words and see what they mean. They're not a secret, but I think that it's just kind of this bit of nudge, to the viewer, and just also make it part. I think also, for me, as I'm learning my language, my Plains Cree language, because I wasn't brought up speaking it or being taught it, it's also making it more normal for me to have it part of my everyday thinking. So, incorporate it into English and incorporate Plains Cree. So, I'm trying to think of maybe which one you're thinking of, but yeah, you can look them up, and there's a Plains Cree dictionary that you can look up online and type in the word, and yeah.
I love the idea that people will leave this exhibition maybe having learned a little bit of Plains Cree. See, we are an educational charity, and that is an important thing.
Yeah, it really helps. I think in the moment, obviously, yes, Google is great and we can translate everything, but I think for in the moment when you're actually looking at it, like you're saying, you didn't want to, spell out the meaning or create a meaning that the viewers would have to interpret that way. So I think that's really cool that you've left some not necessarily in English, which for a lot of people is the only language they speak, and it does really help, add to the meaning that the viewer wants to put towards it. Second quick question. One of the common repetitive features in a lot of your work, because again, they're all incredibly different for landscapes and the costumes you've designed, one of the most repetitive features I've noticed is you've painted your face white, either wholly or partially, and I know in one of them, I can't remember which, your feet are painted red. Was there any particular reason for that one most repetitive feature in a lot of the work?
Yeah, so painting my face different colors, whether it's white or red or sometimes gold in some of the images. That's kind of, there's lots of different kind of things I'm thinking about when I do that. I mean, one of them that I kind of go back to is this idea of kind of masking and the personas that we create, and so it's a bit of that kind of protection paint. I think that maybe I put up when I go out into the world, or other people do. But it's also other reasons I use it is kind of creating these, kind of creating these different theatrical kind of embodiments of different aspects of myself. So, creating these dreamlike feelings. So, all these images are these kind of quasi-fictional experiences or stories that I'm telling, and so kind of changing, the color of my skin or covering it up, kind of creates that kind of dreamlike version of myself, I guess. And I think it also kind of sometimes I see it as kind of when you're kind of developing your identity and your sense of self, as you go through life, you develop new experiences and grow, and kind of at some stages, you may want to rewrite, who you are, and so sometimes this kind of mask that I'm wearing is almost like creating a clean slate, and for me to kind of discover new aspects of myself and kind of can rewrite a bit of who I am. So yeah, there's lots of different kind of thoughts that I think about when I do that, but that's just hopefully that kind of.
Okay, question behind here. Yeah.
A question for John. Early in the talk, you said at a certain point in time you'd drifted away from painting into doing other things.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could expand on that, but also maybe connected to that question. I was wondering if you do much drawing and what is the relationship between the drawings and the paintings?
Yeah, well, there was like a huge period in the early. Well, I often drift off from painting. Painting tends to take me into where a lot of conceptual forces seem to take over. And, at one period it took me, a very early period, in the early 70s into doing things directly on the wall, where I don't think very few people, it was like new then. And I started to do them in museums, Museum of Modern Art in New York, and German museums and things, and being invited, and it was all very nice. And lots of people were congratulating me and writing wonderful reviews and things. But I became very suspicious very quickly of it all, and not of the art, but of the kind of all these, the art crowd. But really, because I was getting away, these moments come, and at some points there's a check, a self-conscious check, saying, this is not painting. And it's just ingrained in me, is that I have senses, and they're called Rembrandt or Goya or Cézanne or Chardin. And these senses, when my painting starts to stray, remind me who I am and who I want to be. And so that's when I say I stray sometimes.
And how about drawing, John?
And the drawing, I draw all the time. I always have drawn, though there was a period, I must say, for about 10 years, I didn't draw. I came up with this crazy idea that the drawing was taking too much away from the painting, that I was leaving it all on the sheet of paper and not on the canvas. So there is I have a whole room with chests full of drawings, which we've just been documenting, and there's a 10-year period in there where there's nothing. And it was because I thought the drawing was sucking everything out. But now I'm drawing like crazy.
But would you have these drawings out while you were painting, or would they go?
Yeah, I never thought of them as drawings in preparation for painting. And in fact, a lot of the drawings are after the painting. Is that I love to draw from the paintings just to see that I'm not being phony, that I'm telling the truth. So I do a lot of what I think are accurate drawings from the paintings, and they're really about literally saying, is this spatially, for instance, is this 10 feet in front of that, or 6 feet in front of that, or am I lying? Is it doing what I asked the painting to do? So there are a lot of drawings of that sort of thing. But I just draw because I can't help it.
Yeah, we've got 3 more questions, and that's probably Simon. Actually, interesting, I'll introduce you to Simon Chapman, who was director of Ikon when John had his show in 1972, which was made directly on the walls.
Chalk drawings, yeah. But following up on the drawing question, you've answered in relation to paintings. What about printmaking? And does drawing have a different function in the preparation for prints and your reflecting once the prints are completed, your reflection on whether or not it is doing what you had in mind when you were doing initial sketches? Can I relate the question to you as well, Meryl? Do you do any preparatory or any drawing at all? And is it as I imagine in the case of John's case, where it would be crayon or pencil or ink on paper? What sort of drawings do you do?
You want to answer first?
Yeah, I do draw, but it's more in the they're very rudimentary drawings, not very not very skilled, but yeah, that's a big part of how I like flesh out my ideas. So I've been saying before throughout the days, but I I'm not a photographer that I'm always carrying my camera with me, but I always have a notebook with me, and sketching down either thoughts, or I'll do just simple drawings of ideas as they come to me, and then usually I take those kind of out of my small book, and then I make kind of bigger drawings that I then kind of pin up, that maybe are a bit more detailed, and pin them up on my wall and kind of go from there in terms of doing more research around what my initial thoughts are, but I don't show those. But it is a big part of, I guess, my first way of kind of expressing my ideas. So.
And John, printmaking.
Yeah, well, printmaking, I think the first thing, when I won the John Moores Prize here, the first thing I did was go out and buy a printing press. And I still have it, and I have several printing presses now. I've always printed. I love printing. I always find it's a great way for printmaking to chase the painting. It seems to give me lots of ideas for painting. I just love the process. I love working with printers. I like, because it's so lonely in the studio, to go and work at a print shop with a group of printers is always embarrassingly wonderful and funny, and it's nice to laugh for a couple of weeks, continuously with them, and also be serious, of course. If I look at great printmaking and look at great artists who've made printing like Matisse or Picasso, it's not an aside. You do feel that these prints they're making change their paintings. I was, before we came up here, we were in London, and I was looking at some Picasso prints. One particular print that was never editioned, and it was sort of something. And out of it came, you could see out of this one gorgeous print, which was impossible to edition, came like this whole series of probably 20 or 30 wonderful paintings. So the print was pushing the painting, and I occasionally, I've seen some great prints by Frank Stella, but I'm a good friend of his ex, Ken Tyler. We're friends, and without Ken Tyler, Frank Stella would never have made those those relief sculptures, and it was because of the prints. The prints made it all happen.
Okay, a couple of questions down here in the front row and next to you two. So,
just a very quick question for you. Do you have a Cree name?
Yes, I do.
Would you mind sharing that?
Yeah, so I actually, funny enough, I just got my traditional name, Plains Cree name, last summer through this project, because I was photographing in and around the area, and for a little while I had been kind of in discussions with my father about potentially getting a name. So I got one last summer, and it's Apasuasquay, and it's Southern Rafter Sundance Woman. And I got it at a Sundance, which is a very traditional ceremony, 4-day long ceremony that the Plains Cree do. And it was a very emotional kind of time to get one, and very meaningful, and it, I can use it like my regular name. People can call me that, so anyways,
thank you.
I've got a question for you, actually.
Oh, for me?
You're the curator. I know John's work from. I'm a painter, and so I've seen it mainly through catalogues that I've got shipped over from the States. And so the first time I've seen your new work, and the first time I've been introduced to your work, Meryl, and hearing your journeys and what this work, both of your work, is about, I think it's profoundly genius, brilliant of what you've done as a curator. Could you tell us how you got to this point of putting these two great artists together?
It's interesting, actually, because a lot of it's quite intuitive, and you don't realize what you're doing until you've made the decision. And very often it's not until the end of the exhibition that you've organized that you realize what you were on about, particularly if it's a group exhibition. I first encountered Meryl's work through the research I was doing for the Québec City Biennial, which happened earlier this year. So that was a more recent thing. I'd known about John's work for a long time, and it was through a visit that Simon organized to Ikon that I started to become aware of what John was doing now. And I was interested in the landscape references, and I was also interested in the Aboriginal connotation. It's kind of whispering in there, somewhere. And then I like the idea of putting things together that don't look, like they should fit necessarily. I like the idea of foiling. I think a curatorial, often art historians do this. They see something that's like something else, so they put them together, and I think that can be quite boring. I like the idea that differences are confronted somehow, and one thing plays off another. So, it's as unformulaic as that. I do enjoy the fact that at Ikon we've got 2 floors, and I'm often making, what I hope is a juxtaposition that means that what you get overall is greater than the sum of its parts. So it's a way of, sort of an evolution of thinking that brought me to here. Very often it's more by good luck than good design too, I have to say, because I'm not in the same way that perhaps John, when he's painting, doesn't. You may be doing something intuitively and not realize exactly what's going on, and I think curatorially the same applies to me.
It's very zeitgeist, though.
Oh, thanks very much.
But John, these are fantastic paintings.
Thank you. Good review in the Telegraph today.
It's beautiful work, both of them. Really beautiful.
Yes, behind.
Hello. I'd like to address this to Meryl principally, but on the stage, both of you and many in this audience and myself, we have been translated from one place to another, and this often brings up questions about identity. I'm interested in settler cultures. I mean, I was brought up in Ottawa and near Lake Ontario, Toronto, and I was in Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto recently, and the McGill University gallery there had lots of First Nations artifacts and art, but also photographs and records of the settler culture, the dominant Anglo-Saxon, not so much Francophone culture. And there was a sort of dialectic between the art we were looking at and the artifacts, but also the political situations, the cultural oppression. For example, the first Prime Minister of Canada, John A. Macdonald, in about 1870, called the indigenous people savages, and this was, of course, pretty common for that period. I'm interested in asking you, since early in this discussion it was mentioned that you're becoming quite popular in Canada, where do you place yourself in terms of the ongoing interactions between the dominant Western white culture, essentially, and native peoples in Canada? Because, of course, it's not entirely a happy picture. Where do you place you and your art in all that?
An interesting question. I think that I don't necessarily think of myself as an indigenous artist. I think that labeling. People like to label people so that they can place them and understand them. But I think that for me, and I don't know quite how to answer your question, I guess, but that I just see myself as an artist, and I speak from my heart and my own experiences, and what I'm passionate about, and what I think needs to be brought to people's minds, and what conversations need to be started. And I think that, my work will always be evolving, but I don't necessarily always think about, those aren't always questions that I think about in terms of how I place myself. I'm focused on what I do, I don't quite know how to answer that, but hopefully.
Thank you. I wasn't trying to put you on the spot or anything, but I was just interested in how, in your imagery, your wonderful imagery, and your performance art, costumes, how much is that based on stories amongst the ancestors that you've spoken of, native stories? Are they behind some of these images you've chosen?
Yeah, again, my inspiration comes from all sorts of different places. I'm very interested in theater, and but then also with various images over the years that I've created, and specifically this body of work, it was very important for me to listen to the stories of my First Nation community, and so there is several stories behind the images. One in particular image is called "Calling Me Home," was a story that really resonated with me, that was told by one of my mentors. And the image that you'll see is me wearing this quite large mask of a bison standing on a lake. And it's a very long story, but it is the story of the buffalo child stone. And there was this small boy that had been basically left by his parents after a big gathering in this area that they came to every season, and they were all packing up their belongings, and this little baby was placed on a sled, and when they were pulling away and walking away, the little baby fell off, and no one noticed. And so the bison came and started feeding on the grass and found this baby, and basically raised this child as their own. So the child grew up believing and thinking it was a bison, and spoke their language, and one day they were drinking water by a lake, and it was the first time that he really kind of looked at his reflection and saw, that he didn't look like his brothers and sisters and his parents, and he, asked them, Father, why don't I look like you? And then his bison father went on to tell him what happened, and kind of urged him that, he actually should go back and find his community and find his family, and let them know that he's all right, and get to know them. And so he did that. He traveled back to his community, and lived there for many years, had a family. But he soon realized that there was a part of him missing, and that, he didn't feel like he quite belonged with his human family. And so he decided to leave his community and go and find his bison family. And so he did that, and he went, and his bison father said, you can't go between us, you can't keep doing this, you have to choose one or the other. And the man now at this time, said, that he didn't know if he could do that, and but he said, I do feel more at home with you. So his bison father said, okay, well, if you want to be one of us, you're going to turn around so many times and you'll become one of us. But if you decide that you can't choose between one or the other, you'll turn around a couple more times and you'll be stone forever. And so he did. He turned around 4 times and he became bison, and he was jumping around and so happy and frolicking with his family. And in those moments he realized that it was the wrong decision and that he couldn't choose between one or the other. And so he turned around more times and he became stone. And this story has been passed down for many generations. This stone actually existed, and it was a gathering place for lots of different nations and communities at certain seasons. And the stone at the time looked like a bison that was on its side, kind of sitting down. And I really resonated with this story when I was told it, because of my dual heritage and always feeling in between and not belonging almost to either. And unfortunately, this in 1966, this big boulder, this big stone, was blown up in order to create this man-made lake, which is now Lake Diefenbaker. And unfortunately, this was a very sacred stone, a sacred story to the people in this area, and now it sits at the bottom of this lake. And so I'm kind of have become this reimagined spirit of this buffalo child stone, and Yeah, so I mean, that's an example, I guess, of a story that is within the photograph, but you know, you can think about it in your own way as well, you know, your own stories.
It's a very beautiful answer to your question, I have to say. In fact, it might be so beautiful, that's a good place to stop the conversation. I mean, thank you. I thank you very much for the questions have been so stimulating, engaging, and sort of taken us to places that we couldn't have imagined. I'm so glad that I got these two together. So please join me in an expression of your wild enthusiasm and admiration for Meryl McMaster and John Walker.